мы вполне можем переходить к следующему докладу. So our next speakers are Valeria Morozova from the Higher School of Economics and Natalia Serdobolskaya from the Institute of Linguistics. And they'll speak about the typology of indirect question markers. So, you are welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so we would like to present you our research towards the typology of indirect question markers. So one of the key points of interest in contemporary typological investigation is the syntax of complex sentences. However, indirect question constructions are usually left out of the research scope. Thus, there is still a little data on such kind of markers, and in view of that, theoretical works on indirect questions are constrained with the material of only well-studied languages. What is indirect question is? Following test the indirect question is a complex sentence where a dependent clause has interrogative semantics. So let's see an English example. I don't know what you mean. So we will consider a root question is an independent question in the following speech. This definition is basically functional, thus it permits us to make a comparable concept in terms of Martin-Haspel method. I should emphasize that the current research is a pilot study, so we take only 30 languages, and thus all the conclusions and implications we formulate are preliminary. We are making preliminary observations that allow us to adjust the direction of the further research and identify the potential problems. The current study helped us to correct the set of parameters relevant to the analysis of indirect questions. Thus, the study is aimed at the goals you can see on the screen. So, about database. The current overview is an analysis of 30 languages from 20 language families and 2 isolates. There are 79 embedded question construction centers. Polar and constituent questions are described in detail in many grammars. However, grammars do not provide enough material for typological conclusions on markers diachrony, so it will be left out of the scope of the current discussion. Next, the indirect alternative questions most often are not described in grammars, and our sample size do not allow us to draw any generalizations on the alternative questions. Thus, we have only described some interesting features of alternative questions, but not any observations. So, in the current research, we use the following methods. So, about parameters. Indirect question constructions are analyzed with the use of a number of comparative parameters, which allow us to inspect and compare languages with completely different syntactic structures. The analysis is presented in the database format in Google Sheets. So if it is known that a language has more than one way to express indirect questions, they are all documented in the database. Therefore, we have 78 constructions for 30 languages. Comparative parameters are binary, so we can answer for the questions as yes or no, or categorical features of constructions. The features are elementary and can be extracted from minimal language materials or taken for granted from other authors' language description. Such comparative parameters available for the construction are the ones that you can see listed on the slide. It's important to distinguish between markers and between markers used in indirect question constructions and the constructions themselves. For example, in Basque, an indirect question construction can be made with a special relativizer plus an emphatic prefix ba and an indirect question particle al. Um, all the three serve to make an indirect question construction. However, indirect question construction can be made without the particle al for Basque and without the prefix. That means that we have two constructions with three markers. There are some more in Basque, but we omit the detail. We are presenting the topology of indirect question markers, which means that some constructions are counted more than once. So following marking types are tested for cross-linguistically. There are such markers are null strategy when a subordinate clause does not have any specific markers, excluding where words. Quotative markers, various types of subordinators, question words and particles, and disjunctive particles and conjunctions, and two predicate constructions. Okay, so let's begin from the null strategy. The null strategy is indirect question constructions that does not involve any specific interrogative markers. In such, as for root questions, interrogative semantics is defined contextually or intonationally, like in the following example. You can see from aesthetic. As for embedded questions, a direct quotation may be distinguished from indirect question construction via Deixis shift. For example, you can see such shift in English. So we can see that root question will be asked as what do you want? But in indirect question construction, we will shift you to I. For example, he asked me what I wanted. So such shift is obligatory for indirect question constructions. Okay. We divide null construction into two subtypes. We have true null constructions that are polar questions that indeed have no specific markers showing that they are indirect questions. As far as concerns words questions, they most often have words that serve as subordinator. In true null constructions, interrogative semantics of complement clause may not be explicitly expressed in any way syntactically, except for Deixis. Sometimes it can be accompanied with a specific word order that leads to some questions that we show in the next slides. So the questions that we have about null strategy is that we're not sure whether such markerless construction should be analyzed as null strategy. So there is no specific marker, but there is a specific word order pattern. For example, in Germanic languages. So we have no any markers, but we have specific word order, and that so we are not sure whether we should consider it as null strategy or an alternative strategy with specific word order. Secondly, the same question with the Deixis shift. We don't see any explicit marking, but the interpretation of the Deixis expression changes, and that's and that signals we deal with indirect question. This problem arises with Germanic and Romance and many other languages. So, okay. There is, in what concerns null strategy, we can make the following implication that in polar indirect questions are marked with the null strategy. Then it is also possible for work questions, for example, in 2 minutes. And if indirect questions are marked with null strategy, then it's also possible in root questions. For all examples that we have, it is possible in the languages listed above. So I yield the floor to Natalia Vladimirovna.
Yeah, thank you. Could you stop sharing the screen, please? So, okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah, sorry for that. Okay, so next is we consider question particles. So there are particles that can be used both in indirect questions and in root questions, as a year in superior. These are most often restricted to a specific question type. So to polar questions, either to polar questions or to WH questions. Often they are used both in root questions and IQs, but there are some exceptions. So there are specific question particles for WH questions, as al in Basque, as you can see from the example. And there are languages that have specific indirect question particles for polar questions as well. If we compare the particle distribution among the question types in root and IQs, then we can see the following picture. Mostly the languages prefer to reserve a question particle for a particular question type. So only polar or unspecified, that means polar or WH. This is this square, or is reserved for WH questions only, both in IQs and in root questions. But still, you can see that there are some languages that allow difference in type distribution. So one example here, one example here, right? One example here, and one example here. Okay, then the next type is quantatives. The quantitative particles can be used to mark indirect questions, as well as they can be used in direct speech encoding, as in this example from Mian, this bar particle quantitative. However, that raises the following questions. Does it make sense to include all the constructions having quantitative markers? If we do, we would include for Russian, for example, everything, including типа, как бы, вроде, etc., etc. And for that means that for big languages, we would have about 20 constructions in our sample, which we don't want to, and there would be a disbalance for big, so official languages with big, large corpora, and for minority languages. So we distinguished between direct and indirect questions based on the dialectic shift that is exemplified here, but that makes us ask a question: do all the languages have the constructions with the dialectic shift? And for example, Patience Epps writes in her Hoop grammar that mostly the quoted material is does not show, well, she doesn't say it's explicitly, but she says that it's always formed in the same way as the quotation is the direct quotation. And all the examples are that way, without the dialectic shift. So maybe there are languages without the dialectic shift, and that means that it's not a good criterion for some languages. Then the next type of marker is subordinators. Thank you. Adverbial clause markers, complementarizers, and relativizers. So the adverbial clause markers include conditionals and concessives, which is quite expected because there is a means connected with the truth of the proposition and with answering yes and no. and quite expectedly, conditionals are used either to introduce polar and WH questions or polar questions only. Then we have complementizers, out of which 5 include nominalizers. And the complementizers are unlikely to introduce polar questions only. They most often take both polar and WH questions, or just WH questions. And there are 2 languages that have specific complementizers, like weather in English. Okay, then relativizers can also be used in 7 languages. And the next strategy is, the next marker is disjunctive. So we mean the cases when the disjunctive is used without the second component of disjunction. Like in this case, the man asked me if he should take me in the truck. You don't have the other alternative explicitly stated, but still you have the disjunction marker la here. There are 5 such cases. This is different from 2 predicate complexes when we have explicitly stated alternatives for a question that is, well, basically similar to alternative, but it is used to encode polar questions as well. For example, for Chinese, the authors we cite say that it's the main strategy of forming root polar questions. Literally, he asks me, his mother busy, not busy? And in the same way, IQs are indirect questions are encoded. So in some, the 2 predicate complexes present a great variety of cases. Sometimes they include complementizers, sometimes not. Sometimes they include question particles, as in the example from Chuvash. Vasya asked, Masha is coming, is not coming, with a question particle. And next to this, you see the complementarizer tese. Then this type can also include conditionals and dubitative markers, which are themselves markers of indirect question. Like in the example from Tundra and Nenets, where we have the conditional together with the dubitative. And this means literally if he's coming, if he's not coming, with a dubitative. And in this language, the second predicate can be dropped. So we can only have the first one. And that makes it quite a loose construction, where it seems that the languages that have self-constructions, many of such languages have several alternatives of making this. For example, in Udige, we can have the nominalized form here, Viwende, and it can be it can be used with or without a disjunctive there here. It can be also occur with and without negation, and so on. Sometimes it takes the auxiliary, sometimes it takes the negative verb form, sometimes it takes the proverb. So he was, whether he comes, whether what does, the verbs of this makeup. So the definition of 2 predicate complexes is not clear enough, and that means they seem to show quite a loose structure, and they're not easy to distinguish from alternative questions, and they show a lot of variation. So this is a distribution. Thank you, 1 minute. This is the distribution of all the types in the diagram, and some implications quickly. So it seems that if a question particle is used both in root and IQs, it usually covers the same question types. It often covers the same language types. Then if IQs are marked with a null strategy, it is also possible for root questions of the same type. If a two predicate construction is possible for root questions, then it's also possible in IQs. That says that actually many restrictions concern the distribution of strategies among question types. So we divide them the strategies between the four types. There are strategies that can be used in polar questions and unspecified. That means in polar and WH. Then there are strategies that can be used in WH and unspecified. There are strategies that can be used in all the three types. And there are strategies that are restricted to polar questions only. And the distribution is as follows. So the nominalizations and the null strategy prefer this square, right? So unspecified or WH only. That's quite expected for null strategy that actually for the null strategy, we know that WH word is actually a signal of subordination. And for nominalization as well, because nominalizations can refer to one argument of the embedded clause. Then for polar only, the black square, we have the disjunctives and two predicate constructions also expected because they point to the answer yes or no between, so the choice between the two alternatives. Then let's see the green square. Conditionals and concession clauses can be unspecified or polar only. Also expected because they're concerned also with the yes, no answers, and specific IQ complementizers also here. And there are means that can be used, can show all the four types of distributions. So these are complementizers, quantitatives, relativizers, and question particles. Then we have something I will skip, and some further questions which we can address in the question area if somebody is interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 7 minutes for questions or comments. So please, I don't see any hand.
If I may.
Thank you.
Hi, Ivan.
Thank you for the talk. A lot of great, interesting data. I actually have a data sort of question. So you showed the construction. You said there were only 5 languages, I think, that had a marker of disjunction within the indirect question clause, right? So yeah. I was wondering whether that disjunction marker, where it occurs, whether it has to follow, like sit at the end as in the example that you showed. So as if it was a disjunction structure where the second disjunct is omitted, or whether it can also precede, so whether it can be on the left or right of the indirect question. And maybe just immediately I'll say they're marked somewhat related, because the next question you showed was from Mandarin, where you just had the juxtaposition of 2 predicates, the positive and the negative form. And it just made me think about how in English you kind of can optionally say, so she asked me whether I'm coming, and optionally or not. But that's, I don't know where it goes beyond just a remark.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Lera can deal with the first part. Lera?
Yes, but I'm not sure. I can say that an example with a disjunctive, the examples of strategies with disjunctive particles, they do not. So I don't know how to say it, but we have no doubts about the role of disjunctive here. The disjunctive there acts as I don't know, as a subordinate marker. So it is not the same as disjunctive in polar questions that you provided. So we can share the data to make it more clear, but it's difficult to answer without any definite examples.
So I guess you saw cases where it appears both in some languages on the left and the right, perhaps in correspondence with the headedness of the language or something like that, right?
No, we have no such examples because the data is really poor, and in grammars there's only 1 or 2 examples provided,
Yeah,
so we can't answer the question.
Thank you.
And for the second part of your question, well, it is actually a problem of this, whether he's coming or not. And in Russian, we can also say, я не знаю, придет ли, не придет ли, нет ли, то ли придет, то ли нет. So these two predicate complexes are very loose, and it seems that for some languages, they're very colloquial, and they wouldn't be referred and even present in grammars, right? But for some languages, they seem to be the only alternative of encoding this. So we don't know what exactly to do with that, because the authors, well, for example, for Tundra Nenets, I'm sure that the stylistic criterion is not as important as for Russian, because it wasn't the written language they analyzed, and still they got these examples. And I myself, when dealing with minority languages, noted such examples that people gave me without telling that they are kind of colloquial or underrated, or so. Yeah, so that means that we should draw a line somewhere, but we don't know where.
Fair enough. Thank you.
More questions? Comments?
Maybe
Dmitry Gerasimov.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Timur, you're next.
Yes.
If I got you right, you mentioned, speaking of question particles, that you had 2 constructions with particles specific to WH questions.
Yes.
I wonder what languages these were from, and whether these particles were somehow specific to indirect questions or shared with root questions as well.
Well, actually, in Basque, there are 2 such particles. One of them is al. I don't know the origin.
No, but these are for polar questions.
Yeah. You mentioned.
I mean WH questions. Yeah.
For WH questions.
I suspect one is Japanese, but I wonder.
I think we don't have. Yeah, we don't have Japanese in our samples.
No, we don't have it, but I look up it now. But
I'll just have a look which languages.
yes, yes.
Well, if it takes time, I can just like.
Spiral language. It is the spiral language. That's a marker or something like this.
Ket, Chuvash.
Yes.
Yeah, Chuvash. We have a special particle only used in WH questions. In Udege, right? In Hebrew. Well.
The question was whether they are specific for indirect questions. Yeah. They are not specific for indirect questions.
Okay.
At least I can see one example where that's not true.
Okay, thank you very much.
Timur.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure what was exactly wrong with Lesgen or Lesgi. That it is exceptional.
Nothing wrong.
There is a question marker that is specific only for alternative indirect questions, and that is unusual. So we have no any entries where there could be any specific markers for alternative questions, but such example is in Lesbian question language.
But it is not an absolutely dedicated marker. It is the same marker as in ordinary questions.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
May I ask also a question? So I'm wondering how can you tell apart cases where you have the same strategy in direct and indirect questions, and cases where you have a specific strategy in indirect questions, and then this very same marker can be used in root clauses and involves insubordination. So like German ob clauses, for example.
Yeah, of course, it's a problem. Yeah. Yeah, we mostly, we mostly rely on grammars and the authors, because of course for languages we know we can draw some conclusions ourselves, but when we analyze grammars, we try, well, what we do, we try to find this marker everywhere in the grammar, and we more or less have some expectations. If we see that it's a particle, then the first question we ask is it used in root clauses? And we look for such examples. If we don't find any, if we don't find it in the grammar, in the specific section of the grammar, then probably, most probably, it's only used in insubordination. And in that case, we just omit, well, we can just think of it, speculate. In that case, we think that it's not that important. So I think that's maybe you could suggest another methodology of looking at that. No?
No, I mean that I'm not sure whether I can distinguish between them, even for those languages I'm familiar with. So how can I tell that op questions are not a minor strategy of forming a root question, but specific insubordination strategy? So it's not the question for your methodology, but
yeah, of course. Yeah, I see. But I think if we have just a grammar with a small number of texts, and if we don't find it in the whole grammar and in the text, then we can say that it's reserved to IQs, right? To indirect questions. Because why we know that for German? Because we have large corpora, and because we have grammars that analyze every single aspect of this language. Of course, we know too much, actually. Yeah, and if we speak of such, well, if we enlarge our sample to a big number of languages, we simply don't have the access to such data for every language we deal with.
Sure.
I think it's inevitable.
Okay, thank you very much. Давайте поблагодарим докладчиков. На этом Спасибо. На этом наша секция номер 6, предпоследняя секция, завершается.